Hi friends, I'm so excited to tell you about my new book, Bible Stories for Grown-Ups, Reading Scripture with New Eyes. I'm Josh Scott, I'm the lead pastor at Grace Point Church in Nashville, Tennessee. And I wrote this book because I love the Bible. And what I began to realize over time is that as I grew and changed and learned, that my understanding of some of these wonderful stories in the Bible didn't grow with me. And in this study, I hope to offer some behind the scenes information, stuff you may not have come across in your normal reading of the Bible. We'll dig into familiar interpretations, and then we'll ask, what might it look like to read this story through a grown-up lens? My hope is this book will help deepen your love and appreciation of the Bible. But not only that, that would help you maybe have a different understanding for the world around you, for who you are, and for what it means to partner with God in this world to bring the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven.
Hello, everybody. It is so good to be with you again. My twin daughters and I had such a good time being with you in person in May when we were there, and it's great to be back with you virtually. I appreciate so much that you've been talking about the book I wrote, Bible Stories for Grown-Ups. You've been in this series, and Pastor Ryan invited me to come and to do the last week of the series, which focuses on this miracle that happens where Jesus heals a blind man in a couple of stages. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. And, you know, when I think about this story, I can't help but think about the fact that every year, pretty much every year, unless I forget, I schedule a visit with my optometrist. I wear contacts, I wear glasses. My vision has changed a lot over the years. And so what I do every year is I go in and they run some tests. They blow that puff of air in my eye, which I just can't stand. They dilate my eyes and shine lights in them. And then there's this thing that happens where they put this, you're in this chair and they put this device in front of you and you lean your face in and you're staring ahead at these letters of different sizes. You know the experience. And essentially the optometrist will say, okay, which one is clearer? Is it clearer here or is it clearer here? And he'll flip the lenses back and forth. And I'll try to make a judgment on which one is clearer or if there's really no change. And somehow through all of that process and procedure, that's how the optometrist figures out what my prescription will be. And almost every year that I go, especially as I've gotten older, almost every year there's a change in my prescription. I'm seeing differently over the course of the year between the last visit and the current visit. And that means every year my prescription gets updated. I need new lenses in my glasses. There's a tweak to my contact lens prescription. It's an evolving sort of situation. It changes. My vision changes as I grow and as I age. Things are changing. And that's going to play a big role in this story, believe it or not. This idea of an evolving, changing way of seeing, an evolving, changing way of lenses. And I want to begin just by setting this story in sort of the context of the miraculous in the Bible. For lots and lots of people, we get stuck a little bit on the debate and the question of whether or not these kind of stories, these stories of the miraculous, whether we should take them literally or whether they're metaphorical or whatever. And for lots and lots of Christians, it seems like the idea of the miraculous being literal is really, really important. I have a friend who a few years ago, he got invited to go to one of those Easter Passion plays at another church near where he lives. And he went to the play and he says that he went and he sat and he watched it. And one of the things that happened, sort of the narrative arc of the play, was just Jesus performing miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle. And then all of a sudden they crucify him. And he said, two things stood out to him. One, that if you didn't know the story of Jesus, his crucifixion made zero sense because all he did was miracle, 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 crucifixion. Didn't make sense. Like, why are they crucifying this guy? But the other thing he noticed was that if you were to take away the literal nature of these miraculous events, that literally, there would be nothing left. No explanation of why Jesus mattered, no explanation of his life or his death. Like, it all hinged on these sorts of things being literally true. And what I love about the way the Gospel of John talks about these things, and it's a little different than the way the other Gospels do, The Gospel of John calls them signs and wonders. Signs and wonders. So it's a little different, right? Like what's the point of a sign? The sign isn't the point. If you're driving down the road and you see a sign that says, Chandler, 10 miles, or Tempe, 20 miles, or and it's telling you, turn left here. The point isn't to stop and admire the sign. The point isn't to put your car in park and just stand there and gaze at the sign that's giving you the directions. The whole point of the sign is that signs point. Signs focus our attention in a direction. They're trying to say, this is where the action is. This is where you're going. This is where you need to be. This is where you're headed. And so what if we just tabled for a second this whole debate and discussion around literal, non-literal, which are metaphoric, which aren't? What if we just left that aside and we asked the bigger, more important question, which is, believe whatever you want about how literal or non-literal these things are. Let's ask the question, what do they mean? Because signs, the whole job of a sign is to point us in a direction, to get our attention focused in another place. So as we think about this story in the Gospel of Mark, I'm going to think about it as this is a sign that's trying to get our attention. It's a sign that's trying to point us in a specific direction. And so let's just begin walking through this particular story from Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 22. They, Jesus and his disciples, came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand, led him out of the village, and when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid hands on him. Now, when I'm reading this, when I'm reading this text, one of the first things that stood out to me is this idea of Jesus takes him outside the city, and then he puts saliva on his eyes. Saliva is a $10 word for spit, which seems to be, like if there's a if there's a soundtrack playing, this is like where the record scratches. You can imagine this man he's sort of, his friends have brought him to Jesus. They're entrusting him in his care to Jesus. Jesus takes him by the hand. This is going to be a big moment. And then Jesus spits. And Jesus spits, I'm imagining, either on his hands or directly on the man's eyes. However, he puts spit on the man's eyes. This story takes a bit of a turn. Because when I hear this, in my cultural lens and context, I think spitting on someone is a sign of disgust. It's a sign of dehumanization. But in the ancient world of Jesus, different time, different culture, different context than ours, spit actually was believed to have had healing properties, and it features in many ancient healing stories. So this is not a unique thing to Jesus or to the Bible. It's something from the ancient world. And while it's out of place for us, for Mark's original audience, they would have been tracking with the story. Now, there's another possibility of why Mark uses this, why Mark includes this. So Mark wrote his gospel. It's the earliest gospel. Even though it's second in the canon, it's the oldest, written sometime around or just after the year 70. And the year 70 is significant because the year 70 is the year that the Romans destroyed the temple and destroyed Jerusalem. So it is sort of an end of a world, end of the age event for the people living there in that time. And so the Roman emperor during this particular period, a guy named Vespasian, there's a couple of stories connected to him. Two Roman historians, one named Suetonius and one named Tacitus, they tell stories about the Emperor Vespasian healing a man who was blind by spitting on his eyes. Now, I don't know this, but around the year 70, when Jerusalem was being destroyed and the temple was being destroyed, that's when Vespasian ascended to the throne. Is it possible that Mark uses this particular detail as a way of showing the central conflict in this gospel between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of Rome, between the vision of Jesus and the vision of Caesar, between empire and God? Like there's this conflict happening at the center of Mark's story. I don't know. That doesn't feature centrally to what I want to talk about, but it's one of those things that I can't help but share with you. And if you ever find yourself at a party and there's a lull in the conversation and you really want to take it down further, just share that. It's a nice little bit of fun fact trivia. Back to the story. He took the blind man by the hand, led him out of the village, and when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" Can you see anything? The man looked up and said, I can see people, but they look like trees walking. I think this is an interesting we are accustomed to Jesus doing a thing. Often in some parts of the Gospels, Jesus doesn't even do anything physical. He doesn't spit. He doesn't lay his hands on a person. Sometimes in the Gospels, somebody's all the way over there, far away, and Jesus just speaks something and they're healed long distance. And yet in this particular story, the man is right in front of Jesus. Jesus actually interacts with the man, touches the man. And when he asks, what do you see? He says, I see what I know are people, but they look like trees walking. It's like his vision has started to come back to be restored, but it's not quite there. Several years ago, maybe a decade ago, we used to play with some friends from the church I was pastoring at the time. We would play basketball every Sunday evening. It was one of the highlights of the week. We would do the whole day at church, and then we would all get together at one of the local schools, and they allowed us to use the gym, and we would play, and lots of people would show up, not just people from our church, but it was like a big community thing. It was so much fun. One particular Sunday night, we were playing, and I was playing defense. I was guarding somebody, and he went up for a layup, and I went up to block the shot. I'm 6'8". That's one of my favorite things to do when I play basketball is block a shot. But when his hand went up, and when he went up and I went up, his hand went directly into my left eye. Like his finger went directly into my eye. And it was so painful. And when I finally, got my bearings and got the courage to try to even open up my eye because it hurt so badly, it looked like somebody had placed their hand right in front of my eye. And I could see things moving around. I could see shapes, but I couldn't see like the definition of anything. And I was really, really worried that I was never going to be able to see anything. And this eye still gives me some problems sometimes with sensitivity. But when I read that, I remember that story of I can sort of make it out a little bit, but it's a little fuzzy and it's not quite clear. And there's no definition to it. It's just like amorphous shapes everywhere. And that's what happens at the beginning of this story. This blind man, is touched by Jesus, and it sort of helps. He begins to be able to see, but it's not a complete and total healing, which leads to Jesus then laying his hands on him again and looking intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. What an interesting story. Jesus spits on his eyes, lays hands on his eyes, sort of begins to see, but then once again, Jesus touches his eyes and looks intently at the man, and then the man's vision is completely restored. I think that the Jesus' use of saliva in this story isn't the only oddity. The bigger oddity is that his first attempt to heal the man doesn't take. It doesn't work. It doesn't bring the healing this man longs for. And I'm guessing that's probably why Matthew and Luke don't include this story from Mark. And think about how odd this is. Matthew, if you were to go to the Gospel of Matthew incorporates 90% of the Gospel of Mark inside his Gospel. Now, it roughly breaks down to of 678 verses in Mark, Matthew uses 600. I mean, this is a total copyright infringement, total breaking copyright laws in the modern world, right? Matthew basically incorporates. Now, he does some tweaking and changing to some of the details here and there, but he basically takes Mark, 90% of it, and puts it in his gospel. Luke uses about 65% of Mark as a base for his gospel. It's interesting that they use so much, especially Matthew, so much of Mark is incorporated, but this particular story is left out. I wonder if they felt the same discomfort we do with this story, which is, what was Jesus just off his game that day? Was he just not feeling it? Was there something wrong? How in the world does Jesus, who can heal from a long distance, he can Hail Mary a healing? How is it possible that he couldn't right here, right there in front of him? It's a really strange story. And I think the first time when I was writing the book and I sat down and I was thinking about the story, I was like, what do we even begin to do with this story? It's so odd. Now, I get to pause here and tell you about, so the Gospel of Mark, I have a gospel crush, it's on the Gospel of Mark. It's my favorite for lots of reasons. It's the first that we have, so it's the oldest. It's quick, right? The action's quick. It's short. It's the shortest, and so things move really quickly. We're getting things that it's kind of a raw sort of telling of the Jesus story. And Mark is not just sort of a non-talented author. Mark is brilliant. And Mark uses several conventions, several different methods to tell his story. One is my favorite to talk about, and that is the idea of the Markan sandwich. And if that just made you hungry for lunch, yes, the Markan sandwich. The technical term is intercalation. That's not as fun to say and not as cool. So often people call it the Markan sandwich. And it means that Mark has this way of telling stories. And it follows an A-B-A pattern. And so in the Gospel of Mark, the way Mark will often frame a story is he'll begin with a story. That story will be interrupted. That's A. B, that story will be interrupted by another story. And then A again, that story will be, the original story will be wrapped up. So A, original story, B, interruption of another story, and then A again, which is coming back around and wrapping up the first story. And so what Mark does is Mark often uses, so the outside, the bread of the sandwich, Mark uses the filling of the sandwich to interpret the bread of the sandwich. Does that make sense? Mark uses what's in the story that interrupts the intercalation, the story that is sandwiched, Mark uses as a way of commenting on and interpreting the outer story. And so if we want to understand what is going on with this story, and this is just true throughout Scripture, I think people will often ask, how do I begin to, if I'm not going for a master's degree, or if I haven't read every scholarly book on the Bible, what are some things I can do to begin to interpret the Bible in context and differently? And one of the things I often tell people is just read. One of the best things you can do is to read the Scripture within its context, right, within its own book. So look what happens just before your story, look what happens right after it, and often that helps shed some interpretive light. And I think that's the case for this particular story as well. So to just give you a little background about how we get to this story of Jesus healing this blind man in two stages. First, Jesus has, earlier on in the chapter, Jesus has just fed 4,000 people. And then that's followed up by a group of religious leaders asking Jesus to give them some sort of sign from heaven to justify what he's up to in the world. So you have this mass feeding. You have a question about, like, where are you really getting the authority to do all this? Show us a sign. And then we come to Mark 8, verse 14. This is the section just before our section of the blind man being healed in two stages. Now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, and they only had one loaf with them in the boat. They're in a boat. They forgot bread. They had one loaf. And he cautioned them, which is interesting because Jesus has just taken a small amount of bread and fed a whole lot of people. And he cautioned them saying, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. They said to one another, is it because we have no bread? So they're in the boat. Jesus is teaching that they're having this conversation about, we forgot bread. We didn't bring any bread. What are we going to do? We don't have bread. Not taking into account what Jesus just did a little bit earlier. Well, we have no bread. We have no bread. And Jesus is like, actually, you need to be watching out for the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. And the disciples are like, is this because we don't have any bread? They're just kind of a little dense. They're not picking up what Jesus is saying. They're not getting it quickly. And becoming aware of it, Jesus said to them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? Do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketful of broken pieces did you collect? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And they said to him, 7. Then he said, do you not understand? You can sense a growing frustration for Jesus. He's like, I'm doing these things. I'm teaching. I'm doing these signs. I'm feeding people. There's all of this stuff is deeply meaningful and significant and symbolic. Do you not get it? You've been right there with me the entire time? Do you still not get it? Do you have eyes but you don't see? Do you have ears but you don't hear? Do you not get what I'm doing? Now, I'm not going to dig into what is the use of the Pharisees. That would take us on a whole different direction. All I want to say about that is I want to point out that what's happening in this particular section, right before the story of the blind man being healed, is Jesus drawing attention to the fact that his disciples, the people who've been with him, who've heard him, who've seen, who've watched, who've participated the whole time, still don't get what he's up to or what he's doing clearly. And then, immediately after the story of the healing of the blind man, Jesus takes his disciples on a field trip to a town called Caesarea Philippi. And the Caesarea Philippi was a center of imperial presence in Jesus' world. It literally is the combination of Caesar, the Roman emperor, and Herod Philip, right? A political figure in the Galilee. And so you have these two, Caesar, Philip. It's like Caesarville, right? Like this, it's this place where the empire has such a stronghold and a strong presence. And Jesus takes his disciples there and he asks them, in this particular place, he asks them a question. Who do people say that I am? Who am I to people? And the disciples respond, well, some people say you're John the Baptist. Some people say you're the prophet Elijah come back. And some people just say you're one of the other prophets. And Jesus takes that all in and okay. But the real question Jesus wants to ask is not who do they outside of here think I am? The question Jesus really wants to get to is with his disciples is, okay, so that's the word on the street. Who do you, my closest friends, my closest companions, my closest disciples, who do you say that I am? And then Simon Peter, he's always the first one to speak up. He's always the first one to say the thing, right? He says, you are the Messiah, you're the Christ, you're the Son of God. What an interesting declaration to be made when you are in the middle of a center of imperial power, an empire that believes that Caesar is the Son of God. The Caesar is because his father, the previous Caesar, was divine, and the Son of God became divine. That makes the current Caesar a son of God. And you have Jesus bringing his disciples to a center of imperial power, saying, "Who do people say that I am?" And Peter gets it right. Jesus responds like, "Look, flesh and blood did not reveal this to you. This was something that God has enlightened you to see." And right after this story, so a big pivotal moment. It's sort of like Jesus has been like, you guys start getting it. You aren't getting it. And he takes them to Caesarea Philippi. And Peter has this light bulb moment and he gets it. You are the Christ, the Son of God. You are the rightful leader. You, not Caesar. You should be in charge. And then he gets it. But right after that, something else happens. So on the heels of this beautiful moment where Peter gets it and Jesus is like, yeah, attaboy. Here's what happens next. Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man, a reference, a way Jesus talks about himself, Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. So Peter makes this confession, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah, you're the Son of God, you're the rightful King. And then Jesus says, look, here's what you need to know. We're going to go to Jerusalem, and when we get there, I'm going to be rejected, and I'm going to suffer immensely at Jerusalem. And when I do, I'm going to be killed, and then I'm going to rise. He said all this very openly. And then Peter, this disciple who had just said, you are the Christ, you're the Son of God. This same disciple, Peter, took him aside and began to rebuke him. Like, do you do this? Do you take, let's forget that this is even Jesus. Do you take your teacher, your leader, your professor, the person, whoever this person, like, think about the most significant people in your life that have shaped your views and that have shaped the way you show up in the world. Do you take them aside and go, no? Do you scold them? Do you rebuke them? At least I guess he does it privately, but this is quite the bold move from Peter. He takes Jesus aside and begins to rebuke him, but turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Woo! What a story. It goes from, you are the Christ, the Son of God, to Jesus saying, yes, and I'm going to Jerusalem, I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to die. And then Peter says, no, Jesus, you don't know how this Messiah thing works. You don't know how this whole thing's supposed to shake out. You don't die. If anything, you do the killing. Like, this is not how this is supposed to work out. We would never allow you to go to Jerusalem and then be executed by the empire. We would never allow this to be the way this plays out. And Jesus calls him Satan. Get behind me, Satan. Talk about whiplash. Talk about being on a roller coaster of emotion. Peter goes from this bold declaration that Jesus is God's Messiah to being called Satan by Jesus himself, all in the span of a handful of verses. Now, a quick bit about this whole Satan thing, because I think it's important to note. In Hebrew, it's the word ha-satan. It means the Satan. It is not a name for like a being who lives somewhere in the caverns under the earth, who wears a red jumpsuit and has a pitchfork and a pointy tail. That's not the reference. It's a title. And Hasatan in Hebrew means something like the accuser. We could also say it means somebody who is in opposition. And so think about it like this. By calling Peter Satan, Jesus is not saying you are this person named Satan. He's saying you are setting yourself up in opposition to what I'm trying to do, to what God is up to what this whole Messiah thing. We're taking this whole Messiah vision in a different direction, and you are trying to get in the way of it, and this is the way it needs to go. He's not calling Peter a person, Satan. He's using this as a title to express you're opposing the very direction that I need to take this whole thing in. And by the way, for Jesus' earliest followers, this claim that Jesus was God's Messiah isn't really just a claim about Jesus. It's a claim about what God is like. And it's a claim about how God's kingdom would come on earth as it is in heaven. It is a claim that God, through this nonviolent Messiah, Jesus, that God's kingdom does not advance through violence, through coercion, through oppression, that God's kingdom cannot be imposed upon the world, that it only comes through nonviolent, self-giving, compassionate love. That this is how, so to say Jesus is God's Messiah is not just to make a claim about Jesus filling a certain role. It is a claim about the very nature of what God and God's kingdom are like. That God is nonviolent, that God is on the side of the oppressed, that God is on the side of victims, that God has forever, in the crucified Jesus, thrown God's lot in, that God has forever, in the liberated Hebrews from the Exodus, that God has forever aligned God's self with the poor, the oppressed, the marginalized, the forgotten, that God will always be found there. What a powerful, powerful statement and vision. And Peter's throwing this sort of language around, but doesn't still fully get what it is. So he sort of gets it, you're the Christ, but he doesn't really completely get it, does he? Peter is emblematic and symbolic of this theme that shows up in Mark all the time. Mark's gospel has this recurring motif, and that is failed discipleship. Peter's failure to grasp what Jesus is doing is only one example. Peter is later going to go on to boast about how he'll even die with Jesus. And how he would never abandon him. And yet he goes on to deny knowing Jesus. That Judas will go on to betray him. Eventually at his arrest, everyone will desert him. And even before all that, even the section we read earlier, he's teaching, he's doing things, he's doing prophetic action, he's doing all of this, and the disciples still don't really get it. The disciples fail again and again. And I think that there must be a historical truth to that, a historical nugget of like, why in the world, if you're Mark, why in the world do you want to paint the leaders of your movement in such a negative light if it's not historically grounded in some sort of, Jesus' disciples, when he needed them most, all bailed on him. And so this is a theme that comes up a lot in Mark, and we see it right here in this particular story. And really, it's only after the Easter experience that these disciples would really begin to see what Jesus was up to and what it meant to call Jesus God's Messiah, albeit a different kind of Messiah than they expected. It was after the Easter experience where these folks who failed Jesus, who were fearful and who ran away and who were dense and didn't get it, it would be after Easter that these very people are the ones who take over the movement and begin to move it forward and to expand the reach in this kingdom of God vision. And so I wonder, I'm guessing you're already putting the puzzle pieces together here. It begins with Jesus' disciples not getting it. They're not able to see who he is and what he's doing. And then we have this confession, this aha moment for Simon Peter, where he's like, you are the Christ, the Son of God. But even after that moment, he still doesn't fully get it. And he tries to take Jesus off course and oppose the direction Jesus is going. And then it's after the Easter experience where he really begins to see. I think that what Mark is doing, I think this blind man in this story is a symbol of Jesus' disciples in Mark. And I think it's a symbol of all of us, really, isn't it? We don't get it right away. We take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back sometimes. We are like these disciples. We are always in process and in progress. We haven't fully arrived. We don't know it all. Sometimes we have these, we're beginning to see and we're beginning to get it. And then we follow that right up with, we actually didn't get it. We didn't fully understand what was going on. This has been my own experience and my own journey. My earlier way of seeing God was distant, only occasionally popping in to do some kind of miracle for some of us, but not for all of us. My earlier way of seeing also God had the need to be appeased. God needed someone to appease God's wrath. And that's where Jesus entered the story. And really, in the earlier way I used to see things, what made Jesus significant was that he was a means to an end. That if I had the right beliefs and the right faith, if I had the right doctrinal categories lined up and all the right boxes checked, that if I believed in Jesus in the right way, then I would get to go to heaven when I die. And so Jesus was a means to an end. Jesus was a means to me getting the afterlife experience that I thought would be optimal, as opposed to going to the other afterlife experience, which was not so optimal. Then faith was really about believing in this life, believing now so that we could go to heaven later. The point was evacuation from the world. It was about getting out of here. It was about leaving all of this behind. And so we didn't have to focus or worry very much about what was going on in the world because we were going to leave it all behind anyway. That's the earlier way of seeing. But there's a way that has begun to emerge for me, and I'm beginning to see. Not always clearly, not always focused, not always with peripheral vision, not always in the whole picture. But I'm beginning to see that God is as close as our breath. That if we're the fish, God is the water. God isn't distant and detached. That what if we were just to take just a minute right now, wherever you are in this room, or whether you're watching online and you're seated, and just take a moment. If you don't feel it's too weird, close your eyes and just take a couple big, deep breaths. God isn't somewhere else. God is right here. God is as close as our breath. I now see Jesus not as a means to an end for my own individual afterlife experience, but I see Jesus as an embodied expression of the love and compassion of God. A God who is deeply concerned about the violence, oppression, and injustice of this world. I see a faith that calls me not to evacuation, but to be fully present in this life, to work for justice and human flourishing for all of God's children, to seek to bring remedy to the pain and the injustice and the dehumanization that's present in the world. I think that's our job. I think that's our calling. I think that's our work to do in the world. And here's the thing. I don't think I fully see yet. One of the interesting things is I'm 42 years old. I have been a Christian practically my entire life. I've grown up in a world saturated with scripture, saturated with theology, saturated with the Bible. And what I've come to learn is that I'll never arrive. I'll never fully see in this life. I will never answer all the questions. I will never conquer mystery. I will never figure out everything there is to figure out. I'll never, be able to conquer the mystery that is God. I'll never get it all. But I feel like from that earlier way of seeing to this way of seeing, it's sort of like that I'm beginning to see, and I can't really make out all the details, but I can see what I think are people walking around. They look a little bit like trees, and I can see over here, and little by little, touch by touch, moment by moment, this Jesus keeps coming back to me and keeps inviting me to entrust myself to him, to see a little bit more and a little bit more clearly and a little bit more. I am not at the second stage where like I get it all now. I see it clearly now. I'm somewhere between stage 1 and stage 2, starting to make out people who look like trees, but discovering that while this journey of learning to see is progressive, it moves over time. You learn, you leave behind, you embrace, you take with you, you go forward. Like it's this journey over time, little by little. This Jesus who I'm following, or trying to follow, is giving me a little more sight, a little more vision, a little more clarity. And I assume that if I keep following, that's how this journey works. This is not a story about Jesus not having enough oomph to heal somebody on the first try. This is a story of his disciples then and his disciples throughout generations, and his disciples now, us, trying to sort out, figure out, and learn to see. And so my great hope for you at the Well is that little by little, moment by moment, decision by decision, trust by trust, touch by touch, that you will open yourselves up continually to changing those lenses. As I get ready at the first of the year to go back to my optometrist, I know we're going to put that butterfly-looking thing in front of my face, and we're going to flip lens after lens. Is it clear here? Or is it clear here? I think this is the work the Spirit is doing on us all the time. Is it clear here? Is it clear here? So, my friends, may you trust this process. May you regularly go in for a lens update. And may you know that the point of this point of this whole journey is learning to see, learning to trust, and learning to join the movement of God in the world to bring about justice, compassion, love, peace to every one of God's kids. The way I like to sum it all up is the gospel, the good news, what Jesus was up to then and what Jesus is up to now is all about human flourishing. So may you flourish, and may you help other people do the same. Amen.